Inspired by the philosophy of Alan Watts, the exhaustion that so many people feel today is not merely physical or emotional, but deeply existential, because beneath the fatigue of work, relationships, and responsibilities lies a more subtle strain, the constant effort trying to be someone, of maintaining an identity, a story, a position in the world that must be defended, improved, and justified. And this effort begins so early and becomes so normalized that most people never question it, assuming that life simply is exhausting, when in fact it is a performance of self that drains energy, because from childhood we are taught not only how to behave, but who to be, learning to associate love, safety, and belonging with adopting certain roles, labels, and expectations. And once this conditioning takes root, the mind begins to treat identity as a project, something that must be built, polished, and protected. And Alan Watts often pointed out that the ego is not a thing but an activity, a continuous act of self-definition, comparison, and control. And like any activity performed without rest, it leads to burnout, because the ego never feels complete, no matter how successful or admirable the image becomes, since it exists only in relation to others and to imagine ideals, always chasing a future version of itself that promises relief but never delivers it. And this is why even achievement brings only temporary satisfaction, because the moment a goal is reached, the mind raises the standard again, reinforcing the sense that who you are now is insufficient. And this insufficiency becomes a background noise of modern life, driving people to constantly optimize, improve, and reinvent themselves. Yet this endless self-improvement is not growth but struggle, because it is based on the assumption that there is something fundamentally wrong or lacking that must be fixed. And Watts emphasized that this assumption is the root of psychological suffering, because it turns life into a problem to solve rather than a process to live. And the more seriously one takes the idea of being a separate self who must become something, the more pressure accumulates, creating anxiety, self-doubt, and chronic tension, since the ego is always on guard, scanning for threats to its image and opportunities to enhance it. And this vigilance consumes immense energy, which is why people feel tired even when doing nothing, because the mind is constantly working to maintain coherence, to make sense of itself, to answer the unspoken question, who am I in this moment? And this question is exhausting because it has no final answer, yet society reinforces it by demanding introductions, resumes, profiles, and labels, encouraging people to summarize their being into words and categories. And while these summaries are practical, mistaking them for reality creates alienation, because no concept can capture the fluidity of lived experience. And when life is reduced to a role, moments feel artificial, as if one is always slightly out of sync with oneself. And Watts often explained that this dissonance arises because a true self is not an object that can be defined, but a process that unfolds, and trying to pin it down is like trying to grasp water. The tighter the grip, the faster it slips away. And this is why identity feels fragile, because it depends on memory and expectation, both of which are unstable. And when circumstances change, roles collapse, or expectations fail, the ego experiences crisis, interpreting change as loss of self rather than as natural movement. And this crisis can feel terrifying, yet Watts suggested that such moments are not failures but opportunities, because when a constructed cell begins to crack, what remains is awareness itself, the simple fact of being present, alive, and conscious. And this awareness does not need to become anything, because it already is. And recognizing this shifts the entire orientation of life, because effort relaxes, not in the sense of apathy, but in the sense of alignment, where action arises naturally rather than from compulsion. And this is why people often report feeling lighter during moments of surrender, when they stop trying to manage their image and simply respond to what is happening, because energy is no longer wasted on self-monitoring. And this relaxation reveals that much of what we call exhaustion is actually resistance. Resistance to the present moment as it is. Resistance to uncertainty. Resistance to not knowing who one is supposed to be. And what's emphasized that the desire for a fixed identity is rooted in fear, because a fixed identity promises stability in an impermanent world. Yet this promise is false, because clinging to identity amplifies fear by making change threatening, whereas recognizing oneself as a process allows change to be experienced as movement rather than danger. And this recognition does not erase personality or individuality, but places them within a larger context, like costumes worn by a dancer, expressive but not binding. And from this perspective, roles become playful rather than burdensome, because they are no longer mistaken for the self, And this playfulness restores vitality, because energy flows when one is not constantly judging performance. And Watts often pointed out that children embody this naturally, shifting roles effortlessly. Yet adults lose this fluidity as identity hardens, and with it, spontaneity fades, replaced by calculation. And this calculation is tiring, because it requires constant reference to an imagined self-image. And breaking free from this pattern does not require destroying the ego, but seeing through it, recognizing it as a useful tool rather than a master. And this seeing through happens not through effort, but through awareness, through noticing how often thoughts revolve around me, my image, my future, and gently questioning whether this narration is necessary. And when attention shifts from the story to the experience, something remarkable happens. The sense of self becomes more spacious, less defined, and paradoxically more peaceful, because it no longer needs to defend itself. And this peace is not dramatic or euphoric, but quiet and grounded, like finally setting down a heavy bag you did not realize you were carrying. And from this place, life feels less exhausting, not because challenges disappear, but because energy is no longer divided between living and maintaining an identity. And this integration allows action to be wholehearted, because one is no longer split between who one is and who one thinks one should be. And what's emphasized at this wholeness is the essence of spiritual freedom, not becoming a better person, but realizing that the person was never the core of experience. And when this is realized, the question, who am I, dissolves, replaced by curiosity about what is happening now. And this curiosity is energizing, because it aligns with the natural flow of life, which is always new, always changing, and never asking to be defined. And in this flow, exhaustion gives way to vitality, not because life becomes easier, but because one stops fighting oneself. And this is the quiet revolution what's pointed toward, the freedom that comes not from adding meaning, identity, or purpose, but from letting go of the exhausting need to be someone, and discovering that beneath all roles and stories, what you are is not a thing at all, but the living process of experience itself, already complete, already moving, already enough.